taking money from our children and borrowing from China.
To take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is
I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
Okay, I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I didn't want the tax cuts for the rich. I didn't even want it for the middle class. Okay, because you know why? Because it puts a $400 billion hole in the budget, and we just can't afford it.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
And the deficit thing is real, and the debt thing is real. We are really in trouble on it at some point.
Is there a need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in. That's not sustainable.
You know, you cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up.
And we are spending money we do not have.
We have a debt burden that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. It is. You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
Deficit. We think the deficit and the national debt are at a moral level.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
We don't think it's funny. We don't think it's a joke. To lay this heavy burden, we know we're gonna choke. We don't think it's funny. We don't think it's a joke. Before we ever grow up, we're already broke.
Now the final critical step in winning the future is to make sure we aren't buried under a mountain of debt. But now that the worst of the recession is over, we have to confront the fact that our government spends more than it takes in. That is not sustainable. Every day, families sacrifice to live within their means. They deserve a government that does the same.
When President Obama tells you we're running out of money, that the piggy bank is empty, that is just not true. And all economists know that it's not true. Okay, so the question is, why do they lie to you? There's a nice little video by Vlog in which he interviews Paul Samuelson. I won't read this long thing, you can see the PowerPoint later. He says there's an element of truth in the superstition that the budget must be balanced. He likens it to an old-fashioned religion used to scare people.
The superstition that the budget must be balanced at all times, once it is debunked, takes away one of the bulwarks that every society must have against expenditure out of control. And one of the functions of old-fashioned religion was to scare people by sometimes what might be regarded as myths into behaving in a way that long-run civilized life requires.
So he likens it to a superstition, an old-time religion. Okay, we have to do this because we have a fear that our elected representatives will spend without limit. And so we make up this lie that the federal government is like a U.S. household. You hear this all the time in the debates about the budget. The U.S. government is like a household. That is not true.
Where do we hear these statements? From the very highest levels, right? President Obama says, It's a quote. We're out of money.
At what point do we run out of money?
Well, we're out of money now.
Remember him? He really gets this ingrained in the American psyche, this notion that the government ought to run its operations just like a household. It's just bigger, but it's like you and I, right? It should play by the same rules. It should be fiscally responsible. It should not spend more than it makes. If I ran my business the way this government runs this country, I'd be broke and all that. You remember how he used to talk, right? So these are very, very powerful myths that have to be overcome.
Recently, there's a paper at St. Louis Fed. Let me read this and then translate it. As the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become insolvent, i.e. unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. Moreover, there will always be a market for U.S. government debt at home because the U.S. government has the only means of creating risk-free dollar-denominated assets. Let me translate. The government can never run out of dollars. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It is never subject to the whims of bond vigilantes. Okay? That's what the St. Louis Fed tells us. And you can find virtually identical quotes from Bernanke, from Greenspan.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
What it means is that the government is not revenue constrained in the way that a household or a private business or even a municipality or a state government is. That the government in the U.S., the government does not need to get dollars from the rest of us in order to spend dollars, right? That the U.S. dollar comes from the U.S. government. And so fundamentally, that's a point that very few people seem to recognize. I mean, we sort of talk like we think the dollar comes from China. And, you know, in the modern era, the U.S. government is the issuer of the currency. It can never run out. It can never go broke. It can never be forced to miss a payment as long as those payments are due in the currency that it alone has the legal authority to create.
We know that deficits don't cause any default risk, they don't cause interest rates to go up, they don't cause any of that. Now, they might cause inflation if we overspend, but let me say two things on that. Japan's been trying to inflate with hard as it can for 20 years and hasn't managed to get out of deflation. The Federal Reserve has been trying to inflate with everything it's got, every trick in the book, every tool it can imagine for 4 years and hasn't done it. It's failed, utterly failed. It's not that easy. But if there is any reason to think that we do need deficit reduction, that we should cut spending or raise taxes, it has to be inflation because none of the other things are a factor. So let's look at our inflation forecasts. There isn't one analyst out there whose reputation, who has a reputation to defend that's forecasting any kind of inflation. The Treasury index bonds, 30 years, are forecasting very, very low inflation. There's not a single inflation forecast out there. So I talked to Representative, what's his name, Hollings. He's on the Deficit Reduction Committee from Virginia. Why are you pushing for cuts in Social Security, cuts in Medicare? Isn't the burden of proof on the other side to tell you that we have to cut or else there's going to be inflation? Maybe they have to do a little research and prove to you that there could be inflation and therefore we have to cut Social Security and Medicare? Because there's certainly no forecast out there. Why are you just voluntarily out there proposing these cuts? He goes, well, it's a pretty large number and I think we need to do something about it. It's like, what? Okay, there's something very wrong with the political process. And I think what's happened is they become victims of their own propaganda. They've gotten it so instilled in people that we have to do something about the deficit.
The government's deficit has to be considered in context. So when the government deficit spends, let's say the government spends 100, but they only collect back 90 in taxes. We label that a deficit. And the word itself sounds like it's got a negative connotation. It sounds like something you want to avoid. But remember that when the government spends 100, into the economy and only takes 90 back out of the economy, that the extra 10 goes somewhere. And where it goes is into the non-government part of the economy. So almost all of the time, the government is in the negative. That's the red that you see below the zero line there. So the government is almost always spending more than it takes in, which allows other sectors to take in more than they spend. And the simple way of saying that in everyday language is that it allows somebody else to save. And the people that we want to be able to save money is, folks like you and me and our private businesses, to be able to take in more money than we spend. And in fact, it's the government's ability and willingness to run those deficits that allows the private sector to achieve those surpluses. The private sector really needs to live in surplus territory. It can periodically go down and run a deficit, but over the long haul, the private sector can't spend more than it takes in. Private sector needs to be in surplus. The government, by its willingness and its ability to spend more than it collects in taxes, provides that cushion for the private sector to save.
I know, again, there's a lot of concern that foreigners hold a lot of the government bonds, especially right now it's Chinese, okay? And before that it was Japanese. How do they get them? They get dollar credits to bank accounts and to their central bank's account at the Fed when they sell us stuff and we buy it with dollars. So they have accounts that are full of dollars at the central bank. Okay, so there are reserves there. And when we sell bonds, they have the option of using those reserves to buy bonds. So again, it's just a substitution from a non-interest bearing account at the Fed to an interest-bearing account at the Fed. It's like going from your checking account to your savings account. They transfer the funds.
Oscar, I know you're really worried about the debt. Okay, poor little guy being born into all this debt, and everybody in the country is worried about the debt. I know, don't cry. It's okay, it's okay. Now I'm going to tell you how you can pay off the debt. You just need to remember this when you get a little bit older. Okay, what you got to do is you got to sneak into the reserve bank when nobody's looking. On the day those bonds need to be paid, you sneak into the reserve bank, and you then debit the securities accounts and credit the reserve accounts. You got it? Okay. Debit securities accounts, credit reserve accounts. Okay, you got to try it. Debit securities accounts, credit reserve accounts. Good boy, good boy. And you be sneaking into that bank and be careful, okay? And you debit the securities accounts and credit the reserve accounts, and all the debt is paid off.
Would you like to know more?
When one voice rules the nation, just because they're top of the pile, doesn't mean their vision is the clearest.